Hi, everybody. Yep, I'm still sick, so I'm going to record some lectures because I know we're getting too far behind in Module 6. So let me share my screen. Okay, so we were looking at Module 6, chapters 12 and 13. 12 is about social psych. And just to remind us, we did actually have a lecture together. We covered nonverbals, facial expressions, making attributions, which can be situational or personal. We talked about the threshold hypothesis. We talked about the fundamental attribution error, which is when you explain other people's behaviors, you overemphasize personality and underestimate situations, right? And then we do the opposite with ourselves, right? We overestimate the role of personal influences with other people's bad behaviors. We do the opposite for our own behavior, which is called the actor-observer bias. Okay, so we covered all that. We talked about stereotypes. We talked about confirmation bias and how it plays a role in maintaining stereotypes. We talked about this interesting research where they show a kind of implicit component to prejudicial attitudes, that you might think you're an unprejudiced person, you don't discriminate, and yet one can detect kind of implicit, hidden prejudice in people. We talked about the self-fulfilling prophecy, which is why victims will get blamed for being victims, right? It's all about trying to convince yourself that it's a safe and just world, right? We talked about stereotype threat, which is the fear some people might have if they believe that their performance on some test or task might confirm negative beliefs about their group. And we talked about the jigsaw classroom. Oh, not yet. We did, but it's coming up. We talked about prejudice and discrimination, right? Prejudice is the attitude, discrimination is the act of treating people from particular groups differently. We discussed in-group, out-group bias. We talked about how, according to social identity theory, the groups that we are members of are really an important part of how we understand who we are, right? So they contribute to our identity. We believe that any group we're a member of is better. So the in-group is better than the out-group. That's called in-group favoritism. And we tend to view the out-group as kind of all the same. We tar them with the same brush. We're more likely to do favors for the in-group than the out-group, even when group membership is formed by chance. So remember we talked about Billig and Toshfellow's research and the minimal group paradigm, where it demonstrated that people will actively work to make sure the out-group gets less, even if it might cause their own group to get less. So it's probably the case that we've evolved this tendency, right? Because throughout history as a species, we've been in competition with other groups of humans for resources. And then we ended off with the Robbers Cave study, Muzaffar Sharif, where he took these 22 11-year-old boys to Robbers Cave State Park, had them camp in different camps in like 2 groups, and then introduced them to each other via competition, demonstrating how quickly you can get one group to hate another group. You just have to pit them against each other for scarce resources. And then showing that in order to mend this, he had to create sort of larger projects that the group had to work together on. So cooperation fostering friendship and competition fostering kind of enemies. And this is where the jigsaw classroom comes in. Elliot Aronson developed how you can kind of get kids to work together to cooperate in the classroom via this model called the jigsaw classroom, where each, like, kids are put into groups and each group works on a piece of some bigger project. And then the last thing we did, folks, was the Heineken ad, which was just a cool kind of example of how working together towards some goal can help to break down those stereotypical ways of thinking about each other. Okay, so I'm going to move from there and cover some new ground. If I pause, it's because I have to cough or I have to get more warm liquids or whatever. Okay, so one technique for reducing prejudice and discrimination is called perspective taking, which is where people think about the psychological experiences of other people, right? Trying to put yourself in someone else's shoes. So thinking about what other people believe and how they feel can reduce bias. So it's a simple exercise in empathy, right? Where you try to put yourself in someone else's shoes and understand things from their perspective. For example, taking this perspective of a transgender person markedly reduced prejudice towards transgender people in a sample of 500 voters in Florida, right? So they had these people just do this simple exercise of, imagine you were in their shoes, what might you be feeling? And that reduces prejudicial attitudes, right? And this difference, this shift, actually persisted even at a 3-month follow-up. So it's powerful, right? Even just imagining having a positive social interaction with a member of an outgroup can reduce prejudice and can increase pro-social behaviors towards that group. Okay, so putting yourself in their shoes is actually a pretty powerful thing to do. Well, let's move on and talk about how our attitudes affect us. So what do we mean by attitudes? We mean like feelings and beliefs about various things, right? So if you have a religion, if you belong to a political party, if you have opinions about music and movies and books and TV shows and celebrities and whatever, right? Then you've got attitudes. And so these feelings and beliefs are shaped, right? So the question the social psychologists are asking is, where do they come from? Where do our attitudes come from? How are they maintained? And how can they change, right? So they're shaped by social context, okay? So they're shaped by the environment that we're in, and they play a role in how we evaluate other people and how we interact with other people. For example, how you were raised has an impact on your religious beliefs. Most of the time, that relationship is such that if you were raised, with a particular faith and, going to church or to temple or to mosque, then that probably stays with you in adulthood. Sometimes it has the effect of you had to go to church or to a temple or to mosque as a kid and you didn't like it. And so as soon as you're an adult, you sort of stop doing that. Either way, you're affected, right, by childhood experiences. So how you were raised affects religious beliefs. Your religious beliefs, in turn, affect your behaviors. Things like going to or not going to religious services like church or temple or mosque, right? And your engagement or non-engagement in those behaviors is going to further influence and refine your attitudes and alter your life, right? So for myself, I was raised really without faith. Not that my parents took a strong perspective. They weren't, atheist or agnostic. I never heard those labels. They just didn't go to church, right? Technically, we were Protestant Christian, but we never went to church. The only time I was in a church was, for weddings or funerals. But we did Christmas, we did Easter. So I had a kind of casual attitude towards religion growing up. And as an adult, I don't go to church, right? So that has affected my behaviors. I don't go to church. I don't do that stuff. And that certainly is having an impact on the kind of life I'm living, right? Like I have a colleague who is very religious and she goes to church every Sunday. She has a real tight-knit community there. And that's something I don't have, right? Completely aside from religious beliefs, the act of going to a church and belonging to a community, right, has a lot of positive benefits. And so in my life path, I don't have those, right? So, that's an example of how our childhood affects our behaviors in adulthood, and our behaviors will affect our attitudes and our life experiences. So where do we get our attitudes from? Experience and socialization. So attitudes are the feelings and the beliefs you hold, right? And they affect your behaviors. And in turn, behavior will also kind of inform your attitudes. So it's like a kind of cycle, right? Sometimes we behave consistently with our attitudes, and sometimes we don't. So sometimes they guide our behavior, but not always. So when can attitudes predict behavior? Generally, we found the stronger and the more personally relevant an attitude is, the more likely it is to predict behavior, and the greater the chance that actions will be consistent across different situations, right? So if you hold some attitude really strongly and it feels personally relevant, then it's going to be something that probably will predict your behavior. So, you know, these signs that are up on some people's lawns, we had one that went up. It got lost in a tragic snowplow incident last winter. But, you know, this is talking about a lot of kind of causes, right? Black Lives Matter, women's rights are human rights, no human is illegal, science is real, love is love, kindness is everything. I believe all these things, right? I think these things reflect my attitudes. But social psychology would also say that the components that are more personally directly relevant probably more strongly predict my behaviors. So Black Lives Matter, I'm not a person of color, although I definitely believe this. Women's rights are human rights. I am a woman, and I have personally experienced being discriminated against because of that. And so that women's rights are human rights attitude will probably pretty strongly predict my behaviors. Science is real. I was trained in the scientific method, right? I've done research. I'm a published researcher. So yeah, I will go toe to toe for that one, right? So it's you know, we have these attitudes, and the ones that hit closer to home and that we strongly hold, those will predict our behaviors. It's also true that the more specific the attitude is, the more predictive it is, right? So something like, what's better, Star Wars versus Star Trek? We're getting pretty specific here. These are kind of nerd discussions that can get pretty intense. The more specific, the more predictive. Also, any attitude formed through direct experience tends to be a better predictor of behavior, right? So to go back up here, women's rights are human rights. I have personal experience with that, right? Direct experience of sexism, discrimination. So that is going to more strongly predict my actions. Hang on, I need to get more warm drink to figure out how to pause this. Okay, be right back. Okay, got a refresh on my drink. So let's talk about how attitudes develop. We can identify 3 big ways that we end up with the attitudes that we've got. Oh, heck, I need to pause again. Just a second. Okay, attitudes develop in 3 ways. First up is something called the mere exposure effect, which is simply this phenomenon where the more you're exposed to something, generally speaking, the more you tend to like it. So, for example, people prefer their mirror image to how they actually look to other people because we're each more familiar with our mirror image than like how other people are actually seeing us. So just being exposed to that version makes us like it more. You know, it's also true if you think about trends or new songs or whatever. You might see a fashion trend and think, oh God, that's awful. And 3 weeks later, there you are wearing it, right? So just being exposed to something over and over tends to make us like it. Another way we can develop attitudes is through learning. So attitudes can be conditioned. For example, advertisers use classical conditioning to create positive attitudes about their products, right? So pair the product with something or someone you like Rihanna, and the hope is that, you know, the feeling that the person has about the celebrity rubs off on the product. That's classical conditioning. So our attitude about Nivea skincare might be affected as a function of whether or not we have strong feelings about Rihanna, right? So that's classical. Operant conditioning also can have an effect on the attitudes that we have. So, for example, You know, if you're raising a child and trying to get them to do things like recycle and care about the planet, if you praise them every time they put something in the recycle bin, they will not only do that more, but they will develop more positive attitudes about it, right? So not only are you conditioning actions, you're also conditioning attitudes. The third big way, excuse me, is through socialization. We're social creatures. We live with each other, right? And so we watch other people express their views and behave in certain ways, and then we model them in our own behavior. So there are role models out there like our parents, our caregivers, teachers, peers, religious leaders, political leaders, media figures. All of these folks can guide our attitudes through their example, right? So when the Pope says something, millions of people listen, right? The Pope is a big influence on a lot of Roman Catholic people, right? When Kamala Harris became Vice President of the United States, she's a powerful role model for girls and women and people of color, right? So all of these role models can shift and shape our attitudes as we watch and learn, right? So let's talk about the difference between implicit and explicit attitudes. Explicit attitudes are feelings and beliefs that we are aware of. Right? Explicit means kind of known, right, out there. The implicit attitudes are attitudes that we might not know we've got, right? So that's where that ZAPS implicit association test exercise kind of fits in here. The implicit association test claims to measure unconscious racism, sexism, and other prejudices, right? So your ZAPS assignment for last week was all about going through the version of that test that's about gender stereotypes. Okay, so hopefully you found that kind of enlightening. The idea is not all prejudice is overt, that a person can honestly believe that they are not prejudiced and yet still show signs of it with this kind of implicit association test. Okay, so I mean, the kind of message is we all have built-in biases. We all have built-in assumptions that we're making, and we don't always sort of even know that we have them, right? So the use of this instrument is controversial. There's evidence that it might not reliably predict discriminatory behaviors, particularly racial and ethnic discrimination. But you know, it's certainly generating a lot of research into implicit attitudes. Okay. My timer. I don't want these segments to go longer than 20 minutes. All right, I'm going to stop here and I'll start a new video for the next piece. Okay.